Good morning. Thank you for joining us for Safeguarding Ukraine's Cultural Heritage from Russia's War, discussing with the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. My name is Jennifer Wistrand, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is in its third year. The war has resulted in much loss of life. It has severely damaged Ukraine's infrastructure, and it has systematically sought to erase Ukrainians' cultural identity. As an anthropologist, I know that culture takes many forms: symbols, language, images, artifacts, music, dance. I also know that culture is what defines and distinguishes humans from other species. So when one group of people tries to erase the cultural identity of another group of people, they are trying to erase that group's humanity. Today's discussion will feature a panel of experts who are bringing attention to Ukraine's cultural heritage and protecting Ukrainians' cultural identity from erasure. To open our discussion, we are honored to have Ambassador Mark Green. Ambassador Green is the president and CEO of the Wilson Center. He previously served as administrator of U.S. Agency for International Development and president of the International Republican Institute. He was the U.S. ambassador to Tanzania from 2007 to 2009, and he served 4 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Wisconsin's 8th District from 1999 to 2007. This past year, Ambassador Green had the opportunity to travel to Ukraine and see firsthand the destruction that has been wrought on Ukraine and Ukrainians, including, importantly, their cultural heritage. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Green.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. As you know, we're a unique institution in foreign policy. We're congressionally chartered, we're scholarship-driven, and we're fiercely nonpartisan and independent. I always say that that special status brings with it special obligations, not to duplicate what others are doing, but instead to prioritize the most important challenges and opportunities, and to do so in ways in which we can hopefully add value and make a difference, which makes this the perfect place for today's discussion. In the earliest days after the full-scale invasion got underway, former Defense Secretary Bob Gates, who we've done some work with, Gates warned us all that the full-scale invasion would be, his words, an era-defining conflict. Sadly, he's been proven right. The numbers certainly bear it out. Hundreds of thousands of deaths and injuries, a quarter of the population displaced in Ukraine, $1 billion and more damage done to Ukraine's power infrastructure. But as we'll talk about today, in some ways that only scratches the surface of what's happening in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin seeks to erase Ukraine's cultural heritage and Ukraine's distinctive identity. In other words, the damage done to Ukraine's many cultural artifacts, landmarks, and traditions isn't incidental. It's a central aim of his campaign to destroy Ukraine. It's part of a much broader effort to rebuild Russian Empire, and of course, in his mind, Ukraine is an essential step in that strategy. Throughout the war, Russian forces have damaged or destroyed over 2,000 cultural objects, and they've seized many thousands of others. 15,000 artifacts are believed to have been removed from the city of Kherson alone. They've damaged or destroyed between 400 and 800 sites of cultural and historic significance in Ukraine. They've attacked the Ukrainian language, erasing it from occupied territories. Their textbooks are written in Russian, lessons are taught in Russian, and the curriculum emphasizes Russian heroism and the Kremlin's propagandized worldview. All of this has made protecting cultural heritage in Ukraine an essential part of Ukraine's war effort. The Smithsonian Institute's Cultural Rescue Initiative has played an essential role in bolstering Ukraine's capacity to do just that. They've contributed expertise and other support to Ukraine's monuments, men and women, during the war, and their research has documented the extent of Russia's campaign against Ukraine's cultural heritage and identity. We are lucky today to be joined by distinguished members of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative to discuss their ongoing research. And joining them is our own distinguished fellow, Blair Rubel, to highlight the implications of Russia's view of culture as a dimension of conflict. Finally, we are fortunate to be joined by a delegation of our dear friends from the Ukrainian Embassy, including our next speaker, Katerina Smagli. She serves as Counselor of Political Affairs and Public Diplomacy at the Embassy, covering a broad range of political and public diplomacy issues. But more importantly, she's a longtime friend of the Kennan Institute. Katya, it's great to have you here, and the floor is all yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Ambassador Green, for your kind introduction. Dr. Rubel, Dr. Kurin, Dr. Hansen, ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure to be back to the Wilson Center, and thank, on behalf of Ambassador Markarova and the embassy team, the Wilson Center for focusing on such an important subject as Russia's genocidal war of aggression against Ukraine and its impact on Ukraine's cultural heritage. In just 2 weeks, we'll mark a very important benchmark. It's hard to believe, but it is almost 1,000 days since Russia has started its war of aggression against Ukraine, the war that matters now for Ukraine's survival as an independent state, but which also matters to the entire international community, which cares about the protection of the rules-based order. Ambassador Green has already listed a number of atrocities which had been caused by Russia in the last 30 months in Ukraine. But I will just mention atrocities that had been taking place in 3 cities in eastern and southern of Ukraine, namely Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Kherson. In 1942, the Nazi Luftwaffe leveled the Royal Opera House in Valletta, Malta. 80 years later, the Russian Air Force leveled the Mariupol Drama Theater with women and children inside as they used the theater building during a bomb shelter, as a bomb shelter. In July last year, the international cultural community was shocked by Russia's rocket attack on Odessa, which destroyed 27 historic buildings, including the Odessa Archaeological Museum, the Odessa Maritime Museum, and the Odessa Literature Museum. They had all been marked by UNESCO and local authorities with the Blue Shield emblem. It is hard to believe that all of this happens today in the 21st century, and that Russia, still a UNESCO member state, so brutally violated all international treaties and conventions, which required her to respect and safeguard cultural property during conflict. Ukraine is home to 8 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and all 8 of them are within the reach of Russian rockets and missiles. In Kherson, Art Museum reported that when the city was occupied by Russian forces, it was severely looted by Russian occupying powers. As you remember, during the Second World War, Kherson was also occupied for 3 years by the Nazis. But Kherson residents, cultural workers, and historians declared that the looting done by the Russians in 2022 was, I quote, much worse than the Nazis' infamous looting of art and in the last century. As I said, Russian missile attacks have wreaked havoc across Ukraine on a daily basis since February 2022. In May this year, the Russian aerial bomb wiped out one of Europe's largest printing houses in Kherson, Factor Druk, which printed about 80% of all books published in Ukraine. In his most recent televised address to the nation of Ukraine, President Zelensky said that in the month of October, more than 2,000 Shahid drones were used against Ukraine. Just tonight, Ukraine was attacked by 106 Shahid drones, 30 of them were targeting Kiev. Literally, this happens every day. And unfortunately, microchips, microcontrollers, processors that are used by Russia to produce those Shahid bombs and other missiles are still exported from the West, from China, Europe, and from America. And so we call on much harder control mechanisms and experts mechanism to stop Russia from circumventing the sanctions mechanism which are already in place. The government of Ukraine is deeply thankful to the US State Department and to the government of the United States for focusing on protection of Ukraine's cultural heritage. As you remember, on September 10th, the US government announced that it is imposing emergency import restrictions on at-risk art and antiquities from Ukraine, because closing the US market to stolen goods will help to fight illicit trade and protect Ukraine's cultural property from export to the United States. I'm deeply thankful to a big friend of the embassy, Dr. Kuring and his team, and the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative for working hand in hand with the embassy and with the government in Ukraine in protecting Ukrainian heritage. And once again, thank you very much to the Wilson Center for giving us an opportunity to see and listen to the report that will be presented to us today. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for your solidarity with Ukraine.
Thank you again to Ambassador Green and to Dr. Smogly for their excellent opening remarks, but also very sobering remarks in terms of the statistics about the number of heritage sites that have been damaged. I now want to introduce our panel of experts. We are joined by three excellent individuals, Dr. Richard Curran, Dr. Catherine Hansen, and Dr. Blair Rubel. So Dr. Curran is an anthropologist and a distinguished scholar and the ambassador at large for the Smithsonian Institute. He previously served as undersecretary, overseeing all of the Smithsonian's national museums, scientific research centers, and educational programs. Following Haiti's 2010 earthquake, Dr. Curran founded the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. He leads the Smithsonian's partnership with FEMA on the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, and he helped draft an international treaty to safeguard living cultural heritage that has been ratified by over 180 countries. Dr. Catherine Hansen is an archaeologist specializing in the protection of cultural heritage, especially in Iraq. She spent decades looking specifically at that region. She's the head of research for the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. She previously served as a heritage preservation scholar at the Smithsonian's Museum Conservation Institute and as the executive director of the Academic Research Institute in Iraq. And Dr. Blair Rubel is a political scientist whose research and writing includes Russia, Ukraine, cities and urban renewal, and the arts. He's a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. He previously served as the vice president for programs at the Wilson Center, as well as the director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Since Russia's war in Ukraine began, Dr. Rubel has been documenting the state of Ukraine's arts, and he's published 2 books under the title, The Arts of War, Ukrainian Artists Confront Russia. So as you can see, I could go on actually with each of our guests. I mean, the list of their accolades is incredible. So we are extremely fortunate to have this group here today. It's a reminder for our audience. So we have both an in-person and an online audience. We're going to have a presentation and discussion amongst the 3 guests. Afterwards, we'll have the opportunity for people to ask questions. So if you're part of the in-person audience, please raise your hand and someone will come over to you with a microphone. If you are part of our online audience, you can submit your questions in one of 3 ways: by email, kennan@wilsoncenter.org, by X @Kennan Institute, or by Facebook. And for both our in-person or online audience, please remember to include your name and your affiliation. And this is a final reminder, today's discussion is being recorded. So I will turn the discussion over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for being here and online. And again, thank you to Ambassador Green for really a very good introductory summary. And of course to our friend Katya from the Ukrainian Embassy for our continuing collaboration and partnership. So what I wanted to do is give background on kind of how the Smithsonian got into this business, what we've been doing in Ukraine. I'll share that with Catherine Hansen, my colleague, who will talk about one aspect of that. So, you might think of like, why is the Smithsonian involved in Ukraine? We have a bunch of museums on the mall to take care of. We have 160 million objects in the museum. And we take care of national treasures. There's a picture on the screen of the Star-Spangled Banner when it first came to the Smithsonian. That's the flag that flew over Fort McHenry in 1814 when the British had invaded. And, there it is hanging outside the Smithsonian Castle on the mall. Not a very good conservation strategy. And it took years of seamstresses to put that flag together. Why did we do that? Because that flag was an important touchstone of our identity as Americans. And our country was so fragile at the time. And that's why we enshrine these treasures. Now, we ended up having to take care of that repeatedly, the 2.8 million stitches that those seamstresses put in the early 1900s had to be taken out because they were actually destroying the flag. So we had to take out those stitches. And that flag is now in our Museum of American History, our National Museum. It's visited by 5 million people a year. And people look at the fragility of that flag, and it gets to thinking about the fragility of our country at the time that was really hanging in the balance. And it's a great way of, again, understanding who we are as Americans. So we got started really as a result of the Haitian earthquake because here was a country that was devastated. Over 200,000 people were killed. The infrastructure was in total ruins. Millions of people were homeless and injured. And yet the Haitians went into the rubble to start taking their national treasures out of the rubble. Why did they do that? Because they were facing their toughest of times and they fell back on their identity. That is, one's identity gives people a sense of resilience. How do we survive tough times? And we see this over and over again in conflicts and natural disasters where people look for the touchstones of their identity to give them strength through the toughest of times. So after Haiti, we got involved in Mali as terrorists were burning up books in Timbuktu. We got involved in New York after Superstorm Sandy. Involved in the United States throughout the country whenever there was natural disasters. We've just had people in North Carolina, in Western North Carolina, because you have people with those floods and disaster situations who run back into their homes, and what do they want to preserve? They want to get the photo album of their parents or grandparents, of their kids growing up, some family keepsake, a family Bible, a quilt grandma made, something that gives them that strength and that sense of identity to persevere. And so we've seen this around the world. We've seen it in Syria, work Catherine and other members of the team have done in Iraq, where what was ISIS doing? ISIS was destroying museums, culture, blowing up sites to erase people's identity. Because if you erase people's identity, and I think as Ambassador Green and Katya both said, if you erase people's identity, they're a lot easier to defeat and program. They don't know what they're fighting for. They lose a sense of who they are. So this is a strategy. It's long been held a strategy. The Smithsonian got involved in all these cases. Right now we're still working with our Iraqi colleagues, the Louvre, the World Monuments Fund, to rebuild that museum in Mosul that ISIS was destroying, which was evidence of a common heritage of Western civilization that goes back thousands of years. We got into training early on, realizing that the Smithsonian could not do this alone. Even though we have hundreds of conservators and a lot of experts, this was a big job that ultimately was in the hands of people in various countries. So we began all sorts of training programs at the Smithsonian. We would respond to crisis, of course. The Smithsonian sent 80 people to Haiti when we did that project. We took over the UN building. We were there for several years. We saved 35,000 artifacts and so on, trained over 100 people, built institutions, and same thing. Catherine is taught at the Center for Culture and Antiquities in Erbil. With our other colleagues from the Smithsonian to train a whole generation of Iraqis to take care of their culture and preserve it. So we've trained people, the head of the Afghani National Museum, people from all sorts of countries that at some time figured that they would need that kind of training and that kind of connection. One of the guys we trained back in 2010 who saw the project in Haiti, saw what we were doing in Haiti at that time after the earthquake. His name was Ihor Poshavallo. He's the head of the Dignity Museum, the Maidan Museum in Ukraine. And he figured, someday I'm going to need this connection and this training. And Ihor became one of our first trainees and then a trainer in that program. And so we've done that kind of training. We've trained cultural practitioners. We always were trying to talk the Army. The lead person in this, the director of the Cultural Rescue Initiatives, a woman named Corey Wegner. She's a curator from the Minneapolis Institute of Art. I hired her at the Smithsonian. She's a true monuments woman. She worked on the Baghdad Museum, and I figured she was too good and got her at the Smithsonian. But when Corey came, we were always trying to talk the Army, U.S. Army, into reviving the monuments men and women. We couldn't do it. It was very tough to do. Then that movie came out, and every general in the Army wanted to be George Clooney. And so we revived the training of the monuments men and women. And that unit. We actually have somebody from that unit here today, Hayden Bassett, who's in the Army Reserve, who is one of those people. And there he is, getting trained at the Smithsonian, where we purposefully, kind of deconstruct the Smithsonian Museum and say, hey, it's all going to... What do you do? How do you evacuate a museum right away to protect it from danger? So we got into that. In terms of Ukraine, we realized, and people at Hayden's museum at the Virginia Museum of Natural History, one of the fellows there did great work looking at monument building in the Donbass and Crimea, and published an important article a month before the Russian invasion. And what he knows, and that was in this Small Wars journal, and what he noticed and documented was the building of Russian monuments in those territories. So what were the Russians doing? The Russians were marking that territory as theirs. That's what they were doing. They were marking territory, monument building and public spaces. And that was certainly a tip-off, an interesting prelude to the invasion. Many Ukrainians, many people in the United States did not think that the Russians would actually invade. That there was a lot of bluster, that what would happen, and but when that became reality, Ukrainians sprung into action incredibly quickly. Here's a statue in Odessa with sandbags, kind of classic. People taking artwork off the wall, trying to get it down to lower levels, and the international community. I remember those meetings at the time, where it was like our Ukrainian colleagues would say, we need supplies, we need crates, we need boxing, we need packing material, we need to do this. And the international community responded incredibly well to doing that. Private foundations like Aleph put in millions of dollars right away for that kind of material. European museums, Smithsonian and others came forward, cultural emergency response. What did our colleagues in Ukraine need to protect their national treasures? Fire extinguishers. I think at one point we probably bought every fire extinguisher in Europe, sent it to Ukraine. But I remember on the weekend we got a call from the head of one of the Ukrainian museums, said, I have 450,000 specimens, Natural History Museum at a university. I need to pack it up, and I need to do it within days. I can't pack up my living room in days, let alone a museum with 450,000 specimens, and providing the boxes, the equipment, and so on. And so the Ukrainians very quickly formed a network. Some of the non-governmental people sprung into action as supplies came in and delivering it to various museums. We relied at the Smithsonian with the Kosciuszko Foundation in Poland to get stuff into Ukraine, equipment, supplies, packing materials, and so on. The government agency in Ukraine charged with protecting cultural heritage, National Center for Research and Reconstruction. Basically, it's a group of about 100 conservators. They have 4 offices, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and Lviv. And they're charged with taking care of the national collections. They had no way to get to them dispersed through the country because all their vehicles were needed for civil defense. So how do you make conservation house calls? as museums are packing up, putting stuff in villages, putting stuff under churches, getting stuff. Who are you going to call? Uber. And Uber came forward, volunteering drivers and vans. The Ukrainians said, this is the type of van we need. We need to take supplies. We need, vans that can carry 8 to 12 conservators to go around the countryside. And that's what they've done. They made hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trips since that spring of the invasion to bring conservators to places, to bring supplies. And this is what they find. This is in Chernihiv. This is actually it was the Museum of Antiquities historically. Now it's a children's library. This was in the pathway of the Russian invasion early on. That long line of 40 miles of Russian military going to Kyiv. And this is what they left in that. This is what you find. Just imagine this as a museum person, an archivist, a librarian. Why? Why bomb children's books? Well, I think you heard that from Ambassador Green and Katya. These are purposeful targets to destroy. A lot of people packed their stuff very quickly, and therefore it had to be unpacked. We had to get conservators there to unpack. People took inventories, did condition reports. This is what people were fighting to preserve, these touchstones of identity. Because if you disappear all of it, how do you, as a parent in the future, point to, say to your children, hey, look at this artwork, look at these documents, look at these archives, look at these works. These represent your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your forebears. This represents who you are. And so people repairing bullet holes in artwork and reconditioning and treating various objects. And just imagine a painting conservator. At the Smithsonian, they do it like in, like surgical rooms. To work on paintings. Here you have people working in basements of churches with sandbags trying to preserve their culture, their nation's cultural identity. And the Smithsonian has helped out by doing seminars, by doing workshops with our Ukrainian colleagues. How do you preserve? I remember one session we had where Jesse Johnson, one of our colleagues, was asked, lead conservator at the Smithsonian. So we don't have heat in our museums. We have all these books. How do we preserve it when we don't have heat in a museum? How do you do that? And how do you think about that? So I think we've worked through so many challenges with our Ukrainian colleagues on figuring out this great challenge of preserving these touchstones of Ukrainian heritage so that they could be available to give people strength now, but also in the future. And we were able to, thanks to Katya's help and the ambassador's help here, work with the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine, and 2 years ago bring the Ukrainian troops to Washington, to the Smithsonian, and then to Fort Liberty to train with US and NATO troops in developing a unit of monuments officers for Ukraine so they can document that heritage. Now I'll turn it over to Catherine, who'll talk about another aspect of this effort.
All right, thank you, Richard. I'm going to be speaking primarily about the research, so just allow me to nerd out slightly here. And I want to reiterate something Richard mentioned, which is a lot of our research work and our methodologies right now are based on our previous work in documenting damage to cultural heritage sites in conflict zones. And so building on the research we did for Iraq and Syria in particular, and those methodologies, we've really gotten, I think, a very robust and systematic look at what has been taking place with cultural heritage sites in Ukraine. And I want to start with this slide because this is really where we began. You've heard us mention Dr. Hayden Bassett there, sitting in the middle, and he and his team and their collaboration with us at the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab, which is located at the Virginia Natural History Museum, identified 28,000 cultural heritage sites using open source locational data, and they've been monitoring these sites since prior to the full-scale invasion. And so of these sites, this really, for the geospatial work we do, forms the basis of what we're looking at. We have sort of three major types of publications and works in general, right? We have something called potential damage reports, where I can talk to you a little bit, and I will in a moment, about our actual numbers for what we think, how much is damaged, and then how much we estimate has been damaged. And then we have a series of rapid reports, and then pretty nerdy academic publications that I am not going to get into for you today, but I'm happy to share those references. And this is collaborative work. We don't do this in a silo at all. This is something where we have a lot of co-authors and a lot of work. It's very interdisciplinary. We bring together anthropologists, archaeologists, museum studies folks, political science folks, and really focusing on making sure that we bring front and center our colleagues in Ukraine. So we work very closely with the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab, which is an outgrowth of our work with Dr. Vasil Rashko, who has come to our trainings that Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative has held in the past. And so it's very full circle that he then was able to go home, take the leadership training he got with us, develop an NGO, which is really at the forefront of documenting damage. They are, anything we can do to support them is basically what's happening. And so we have sort of 4 reasons why we do this research. And the first is to answer the bigger question about why heritage is damaged during conflict. And that's a much larger question beyond just our research for Ukraine. Second reason, we do a lot of this are case studies. We need examples to be able to study the nature of this type of damage and perhaps prevent it better in the future or at least address it as it's taking place. And there's a couple of things, and I'll talk a bit about the types of damage we're seeing, but I want to highlight that it isn't just damage from shelling, damage from active conflict. There's quite a bit of also damage from things like looting. The third is to inform action on the ground, right, planning for the future. A lot of what we spend our time looking at in deep dive rapid reports are key heritage sites that HEMO, our colleagues in Ukraine, have identified for us, are sites that need a close investigation. And then finally, along those same lines, is we're really hopeful that this research can also serve as a piece of evidence should accountability measures take place. And so we're really making an effort to make sure that what we're producing meets an international evidentiary standard. So you can find all of our reports, everything that's public here, and that's on our research page. And I want to start talking initially about our potential damage reports. So this is something led by our colleagues at the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab, and what you see here is analysis. We had a real struggle when we first started looking at Ukraine for damage. I have to confess I'm used to looking at sites in the desert primarily, and so cloud cover was new. And to get around just a lot of rain and snow, we started using infrared sensors. So looking for kinetic activity as proxies for damage. And this is something that's been really spearheaded by our colleagues at the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab. Here you see our most recent report on this. And this is the breakdown of our numbers on our most recent publication report. Hot off the press for you today, breaking news, is that our colleagues at the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab let us know this morning that we currently have 618 confirmed impacts. So that's 618 cultural heritage sites in in Ukraine, my apologies, that we have confirmed damage to. And then for potential impacts, and these are sites where we've seen kinetic activity nearby through the infrared sensors, but we haven't yet manually confirmed that damage. We have 1,732 cultural heritage sites that have been damaged. And those numbers are higher than what you'll see elsewhere. And this is, likely in the ballpark of what is currently being damaged. It takes time to really evaluate and assess these things, and so I share these numbers with you. They're not published yet, but when they do, we'll be sure to send those around. So another aspect of our research are these deep dives, looking at specific case studies. And so these rapid reports that we've published are based primarily on high-resolution commercial satellite imagery and close analysis of that. And so here you see an example from Mariupol there, and that's the Museum of Local Lore. And then much like all of the other civilian infrastructure in that area, it's really severely damaged. And so our reports look like this, and then you can also get the formal PDF online. And this is the Sklovoda Literary Memorial Museum. And you can see that sometimes we don't always have the crispest satellite imagery to work with. And this is a particularly interesting example because, Richard, you were on the phone call with us with the then Minister of Culture of Ukraine, who asked us to see if we could find any information out about this museum shortly after it was hit that May. And so we were able to task a satellite, thanks to colleagues in the audience, we were able to task a satellite to get the most updated imagery, and then we were able to go back later and get a real crisp image of how severe that damage was. So then that's the next report I wanted to share with everyone. And then this is the Odessa Cathedral. And the Odessa Cathedral is a good example of a site where our colleagues at the Ukraine Heritage Monitoring Lab, HEMO, they have been able to go out and do a systematic ground documentation. And so we're really excited to be able to share these rapid reports that include both the satellite imagery as well as systematic ground photos that document the site fully. And pairing these together, I hope creates a real good evidentiary piece of information. So what you see here is that damage there. This is an example of one of the small Catholic churches in a village that was very clearly targeted. And you see the satellite imagery here, and then that satellite imagery with the ground imagery that HEMO was able to go out and take. We have also started analysis on what has taken place in terms of theft of cultural heritage and looting of sites. This is not yet published, but our colleagues at University of Maryland, political science colleagues who are doing quite a bit on the statistical analysis, have been able to work with us on taking a look at, in sort of for the first year, what was looted, what was reported as looted and what wasn't. And this is just a quick map of what was. We heard earlier about the Kherson Regional Museum and the Art Museum in Kherson. And here you see a picture of them, and then using high-resolution satellite imagery, we were able to catch the trucks in the act. They're circled there in red, and they're literally being loaded up with looted cultural heritage art items in this example. And with that, I'll pass that back over to you, Richard.
So, aside from the actual work with Ukrainian institutions and getting in supplies and providing conservation and curatorial advice and so on, and doing the satellite monitoring, working with our colleagues in the U.S. government, certainly with our colleagues at the State Department, Department of Justice, FBI, Homeland Security, even Department of Defense and NATO. We're doing a lot of that work behind the scenes. And a lot of the work that we were doing in terms of where collections were, we didn't want to give a lot of publicity at first. It's like you don't want to wave a big flag and say, hey, stuff is stored over here, Putin, bomb it. Will make your life easier. So, initially we were, quite reticent to publicize and give too much detail out. But, it's become so widespread and so overwhelming that the, publicity starts to help the cause in alerting members of Congress, members of the public, international agencies, and so on, that we have a really big issue here, and that the aims of Putin in terms of destroying Ukrainian culture are pretty obvious, straightforward, and well documented. So we started doing articles in Smithsonian Magazine to alert the general public about this, because again, it's an issue people may not focus on in terms of that cultural heritage and its importance to the Ukrainian people and all of us as human beings. So we started doing stuff on, with NPR stories and podcasts and a variety of network news stories. CBS 60 Minutes did a story with one of our colleagues, Ihor Poshavalo, on destruction in Ukraine. At the Smithsonian, we have an exhibit, small exhibit, at the Smithsonian's Museum National Museum of American History on Ukrainian currency. Because again, that idea that Ukraine doesn't really have an identity. If you read, Putin's, treatise on Russians and Ukrainians, that's basically what he says. Well, we have the coinage that shows the continuity of those symbols of Ukrainian identity and those periods of Ukrainian statehood. We have at the Postal Museum an exhibition of stamps. Again, thanks to Katya and colleagues at the embassy, we were able to get the first day covers signed by the President and First Lady of Ukraine for that famous Snake Island stamp. The, pardon, I don't know if the Wilson Center you're allowed to say it, but, basically, fuck off Russian battleship stamp, as I call it. So, and that goes into our national collections at the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum. At the Folklife Festival, we were able to bring singers and troops from Ukraine to basically sing for their freedom on the National Mall of the United States on July 4th, our Independence Day. And on the screen there from the mall on the festival, there's a fellow who serves in the musician who's serving on the front lines who joined his colleagues from the front lines via iPhone to play with that band on the National Mall. So because those songs, singing in Ukrainian, those are, again, are the intangible touchstones of cultural identity, as Jennifer said at the beginning. The culture has these different aspects of living as well as the material aspects. We've done programs a few years ago at before the General Assembly Week in New York. I was fortunate to do a program with the ambassador and First Lady of Ukraine on the destruction of cultural heritage. We've done stuff at the Helsinki Commission. Many of my colleagues have done work. We last year worked with, or earlier this year, I guess it was earlier this year when again, President Zelensky visited. We worked with the Ukrainian embassy to arrange that he would give a talk at the National Archives in front of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and remind Americans what they're fighting for in Ukraine. So all of this doesn't get done in a vacuum. It takes a lot of support. We do get money from appropriations from Congress, but we get money and support from a lot of folks and have a lot of partners who help contribute to this and make this possible, because this really is a government, a private, a foundational effort. It's an effort that crosses individual philanthropy and international institutions that are cooperating to help safeguard Ukrainian culture. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Ambassador Green and Katerina Smogli and Jennifer and Catherine and Richard for a really remarkable morning. This is a very special story at many levels, and it is important to understand that it's going on, and it's important to understand why that it's going on right now when so much is up in the air. Because as I'll emphasize at the end, there is no peace in that region without incorporating cultural perspectives into it. So we really need to understand that what we're talking about, as Ambassador Green said, is not at the periphery. It's not a sort of nice thing. It's not just that, there's this nice Hollywood movie. This is central, absolutely central to what this conflict and other conflicts right now are about. And here in Washington, we often really don't understand that. I can imagine it took a long time and maybe a Hollywood movie to get people in the Army to understand something that the Army understood actually quite well 70 years ago, that culture matters. Because we have tended, in general, to devalue the importance of culture. And this is a big mistake, and this panel helps us understand why. This is a remarkable story on all sorts of levels. The first part, which you heard really quite dramatically today, is how quickly the Ukrainian cultural preservation community and their international partners responded to what was going on. This was a top order priority in Ukraine, and the international community, represented by the Smithsonian here, but there are also many, many other institutions, responded immediately and effectively. We live in a time when efforts by large institutions tend to be degraded. They're inefficient. We're going to find out how we can all operate in the city more efficiently in a few months when we have an efficiency study of the US government. Well, this is an example of something that worked and worked immediately. And it worked in part because it had been working earlier. And this is an important part. Richard spoke about the Smithsonian's efforts in Haiti. Catherine was involved in Iraq. People actually sometimes know what to do if they're given the resources to do it. So I want to emphasize the point that Mark Green made in his opening remarks. This story stands at the very center of what this war is about. Culture, broadly defined, is not at the periphery of the conflict, it's at the center. As Richard has said, from Putin's perspective, and that of far too many Russians, Ukrainian culture doesn't exist. Indeed, a sovereign Ukraine doesn't exist. What we're talking about is an amusing little sidebar to the real story in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Well, it turns out that Ukrainians have a culture. They've worked very hard to preserve it as a distinctive culture for a very long period of time. It's in part about language, but it transcends language. And Ukrainians were not and are not simply going to fold up their tents and slink away because it's inconvenient for everybody else. This is an existential conflict for Ukrainians. And while perhaps not as dramatic for Russians, it is an essential conflict because if a distinct Ukrainian culture exists, what is Russian culture? How is Russian culture separated from the Russian imperial project? A half century or more ago, Richard Pipes made an observation. It was controversial at the time. I think it's probably less controversial now. That there is no Russian state without the Russian Empire. Both emerged jointly during the 17th and 18th century. They've remained together ever since. And the question, what is Russia if not for its empire, has never really been answered. And this war is going to help bring more clarity to that question. And it's why culture, broadly defined, stands at the center of this conflict. We're at a moment where it appears that we're coming in maybe the final stages of a war of attrition. And it will end when and where one of the combatants no longer is able to fight. But unless we bring in this cultural perspective when we sit down at a peace table, we'll have a cessation of hostilities, but we're not going to have a finite end to the conflict. It's because Ukrainians are intent on preserving their distinctive culture. I hadn't planned to say this, but your remarks brought this to mind. The issue of regional museums. In a society like the United States, regional museums are kind of nice. A place to take the kids, find out about what happened here, but they don't seem to be essential places. But in the 1990s, I spent a lot of time traveling around, primarily provincial Russia, but also somewhat in smaller Ukrainian cities. And I came to realize that I should always ask to see the local museum. Because local museum activists, particularly during the late Soviet period, worked very hard to uncover and retrieve what went on in their community before the revolution, during Stalin, after. And it was an important place to bring together narratives about their community's history that were not only overlooked but often suppressed elsewhere. So each of these regional museums is actually an important focal point for the story, and I think that that's an important point to raise. I want to basically turn it back, but I want to say that when it comes to thinking about Ukrainian culture, it's always been kind of confusing. And the language issue is part of it. The complex confessional landscape in Ukraine is part of it. And this notion that Ukraine and Russia are really distinctive, it was a little bit ambiguous in the past. Russian pretty much was a lingua franca in much of central and eastern Ukraine. A lot of post-Soviet cultural figures and Soviet cultural figures from Ukraine went to Moscow, were successful in Moscow, wrote in Russian. But a very important change began to take place in 2014, and I think we need to remember this. After the seizure of Crimea and Putin's aggression in Donetsk and Luhansk, many Ukrainians, particularly in the cultural and intellectual community, suddenly realized they needed to get serious about being Ukrainian. One of the things that happened is cultural life began to change very quickly into Ukrainian language. Cinematographers, writers began to come back from Russia, in part because Russia was becoming a more hostile environment under Putin, but also in part because they realized that they wanted to embrace their Ukrainian heritage. So the processes I've been talking about really date back to 2014, and I think this is important because that was also a point when a rising generation of Ukrainians who grew up since Ukrainian independence were moving into professional life, having already knowledge of Ukrainian. They studied it in school. They had no Soviet experience. There was no nostalgia for the Soviet Union because they had no Soviet experience to be nostalgic about. And for them, Russia was just a disagreeable, aggressive neighbor. And this is a moment when you look at any number of cultural fields in Ukraine and you see a distinctive turn to the West. And I think that that is an important point to acknowledge. Finally, I want to just thank Catherine and Richard for pointing out that this work draws on earlier works in places where you might not have expected it, in Haiti and Iraq. And that actually points to, I think, an important dimension of the story right now. All of these conflicts are about more than warring elites, natural resources, and strategic advantages. IR specialists can take out their board games and imagine how swapping this piece of territory for these weapon systems will resolve everything. But I think when you take a look at the cultural sphere within these conflicts, it becomes very clear that we're not talking about a board game. We're not talking about a bunch of people sitting around a table in some neutral country saying, well, we're going to move this piece here and we're going to move this another piece there. What we're talking about, and this goes back to the touchstones of culture, which Richard talked about. What we're talking about is what makes human beings feel human. And therefore, there's nothing more important in thinking about this conflict and other conflicts than the kinds of work we heard here today. Thank you.
Thank you, the three of you. It's just frankly chilling comments that each of you gave in terms of the calculation that has been perpetrated on trying to, again, erase Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian identity and humanness. I want to turn over, we've got about 25, 30 minutes to take questions from the audience. So just as a reminder again, for our in-person audience, raise your hand and someone will come over to you with a microphone. For our online audience, please start submitting your questions, and you can do it one of three ways. You can do it by email, so kennan@wilsoncenter.org. You can do it by X at Kennan Institute, or you can do it by Facebook. And for everyone, if you can introduce yourself and give your affiliation. Maybe while people are formulating questions, I'll just start with one question, and it touches on this. Each of you mentioned in different ways this idea of accountability. And I'm curious, Dr. Smugly, in your remarks, you used the word, genocidal war, and you very clearly listed out things that we see in the Geneva Conventions, right? One of which is trying to erase through cultural heritage. And you guys talked about these, again, this presentation was astonishing. I just want to say to walk through everything that you have to do, right, to capture what's taking place. And when you had that image of literally the trucks outside, and then you mentioned the Helsinki Commission. And so I'm curious, accountability on both, let's say, a local level. Is there any prosecution taking place if people are captured? But what about going up to the internet, on the international stage as well? And is there a precedent for that in previous conflicts, like some of the ones you guys have talked about?
Well, in terms of international prosecutions, there's actually not much. And it depends on what you're prosecuting under. There's, the Hague Convention, there's Geneva Conventions, there's the UNESCO Convention on the Moving and Destruction of Cultural Property. And, if you talk to folks at UNESCO and the ICC and others, they'll point to the case in Mali, where people were convicted of destruction. But it's very rare to do. It doesn't stop you from doing it, and I think it's almost, to me, more a question of international kind of morality in a way, and opinion, rather than it is actual juridical prosecution, because that happens very rarely, and where's the deterrence? That said, Catherine, Hayden, others here are doing their best to work with our colleagues. We've worked with people in justice and in state, to make sure that we're doing what we have to do to document that. Maybe, Catherine, you can talk about
Sure.
the standards.
Well, to Richard's point, not only is it relatively rare to see accountability mechanisms take place, when they do or when they are suggested, the lag is pretty significant. And so, for example, when asked for what we had documented for damage in Syria at the beginning of that conflict, by the time we were asked for that, we had not carefully recorded all of our original documentation using the satellite imagery because we didn't think anyone was going to get around to it ever, and it took a very, very long time. And as most folks know, that hasn't come to pass. There hasn't been accountability for damage to cultural heritage in Syria, and while there's some efforts, it hasn't come to fruition yet for Iraq, for ISIS damage. It's a conversation we have for all of the countries that we look at, or for all the conflicts that we've looked at. And so for Sudan, for example, right now, looking at the damage there, having a conversation with, well, is this something that we're just going to go ahead and collect this as if it's evidence and keep a systematic record of everything just in case, though we don't have any information yet as to whether or not there'll be any accountability. And the same goes for what we're doing for Ukraine. We've consulted with a lot of different colleagues, thankfully lots of lawyers and not me, who have come up with suggestions. And a lot of what we're able to do uniquely in this situation is because of how phenomenal our colleagues in Ukraine are, that they're collecting documentation on the ground using basically a systematic standard that we worked with the FBI Art Crime Unit in documenting. Initially, we started using that at the Mosul Museum, doing photographic documentation in a way that someone can go back and look at those photo records. And now that's what they're doing on the ground in Ukraine.
I just Catherine kicks it off because we were together, the team was on the ground at the Mosul Museum. And again, just imagine, here's the FBI teaching Smithsonian people how to look at a museum as a crime scene. Never in my life. I've overseen all the Smithsonian museums into, it's not a Margaret Truman novel or something, and you're actually putting down, the yellow tags and making measurements and doing all that. And, it has other uses. That kind of documentation, whatever happens, in a juridical sense, you have tremendous documentation going on damage that's going to be absolutely important in devising plans for reconstruction. Just to have that thing. We're the power and energy people are very good. Architects and engineers are very good at saying, okay, this building has to be rebuilt. This is what an apartment building costs. This is what it costs for a school. This is what you got to do in terms of rebuilding. When it comes to cultural institutions and cultural sites, we're not used to that. We're used to talking about the beauty of something, its historical significance, its history. So we're less used to getting culture into the planning mix. Blair makes a good point. If you're taking culture into consideration in terms of the international relations, military, other kind of calculations, how do you get culture into the civic planning mix? And Ambassador Green served as administrator of USAID. Well, the money we got from for Haiti, the big money we got was from USAID for rebuilding Haiti in not Haiti's hospitals, not Haiti's schools, not its power grid, but actually rebuilding and saving its cultural resources. And the same thing, the first money actually for Ukraine came from former USAID administrator Rajiv Shah, who was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. And he said, hey, you guys did this work in Haiti, what are you doing for Ukraine? Now, what you want is the president of the Rockefeller Foundation to offer you money to do good work.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you for answering that question. Let's take a first question over here. And please use the microphone.
Sergei Zhuk, fellow at Wilson Center. I have purely practical question. Any empire, British, Russian Empire, try to control cultural artifacts in their provinces. And they stole these artifacts to show this in British Museum or in Moscow Museum. So my question is, do we have channels, mechanisms to retrieve what Russians already stole from Ukraine? I know that your purpose is to preserve and restore what they destroyed, but thousands of artifacts are stolen. And Putin and theoreticians of Russian Empire try to argue that all these artifacts from Kiev Rus, from previous periods of Russian history, are theirs. So how can we retrieve those? We know many of these artifacts now on exhibits in Moscow, in St. Petersburg. How can we retrieve, how your organization, it's a question for Richard, how your organization could claim that these artifacts, using again Ukrainian expertise, Ukrainian historians, how can we retrieve and bring these stolen artifacts, which are part of our identity, back? And thanks to Blair for reminder of 2014. Many of us who are Ukrainians spoke Russians, became Ukrainians and hate Russia. But anyway, it's a different way. But thank you very much. But Richard, it's a more important question for you. How can we bring back what is stolen? Thank you.
Well, look, you raise a major issue in museums over the last few hundred years about the collection of artifacts as a result of military conquest, of colonial rule, and again, we Smithsonian deals with this. Many of our collections came from the U.S. Army and wars with American Indians that were part of our country's history. In the 19th century. It's kind of hard to send an expeditionary force with Smithsonian uniforms to the Hermitage, knock on the door and say, we want, we want all your Ukrainian stuff and we're going to return it to Kyiv. That's very difficult to draw it out. And if you look at the cases that, have continued over history, we have we signed in the Washington Accords here in this town Stuart Eisenstadt and others, with regard to the return of Nazi-looted art. We're still engaged in that. That is still going on to this day, and lawsuits, and the criteria by which you can actually get stuff back. I look at my colleague Catherine, who personally, with her colleagues, packed up 16,000 Iraqi items to repatriate that were claimed back by the Justice Department, Homeland Security, packed up and returned to Iraq that were looted. And that was the Hobby Lobby, Bible Museum case. So these things are ongoing things. It's easier, of course, to try to interdict and get stuff when it's being trafficked and moved around. And there we worked. The State Department chairs a group called the Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee. This came as a result of bipartisan legislation in 2016 that formed that group. The Act to Preserve International Cultural Property. And so we and our fellow, government organizations and agencies work to try to identify stuff. One of the things is you have to identify it. You have to figure out where it's going, what are those lanes of trafficking. Then it's going to come down to somebody at customs in the U.S., where somebody in New York at, Kennedy Airport is saying, okay, is that a tchotchke? Is that, a keepsake? Or is that something that might be stolen? And right now, I think our community is trying to work on systems of doing that better. So the State Department instituted, with support from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, a consultation network, where when stuff is seized or identified, there's a group of academic experts centered at the University of Pennsylvania, at the Cultural Heritage Center. But the idea is, okay, here's a picture of this, here's this. Do we think this is something? And it's not only for Ukrainian objects, it's for anything from around the world. So, right now we're trying to work on are the digital mechanisms we can do, where you can hold up your iPhone, aim it at that and say, my God, this is from, this is a 16th century Ukrainian piece that is coming into the country. So there's many people involved in that effort, and it's more in terms of the interdiction and the stemming of, of looting and trade, which is easier than knocking on the door of Mikhail Petrovsky's Hermitage and saying, Mikhail, give it up.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Anastasia Osipova. I'm a Billington Fellow here at Wilson Center and a professor at the University of Colorado. And I wanted to start by thanking Dr. Hansen and Richard Curran for your excellent work and for your very important work of preserving Ukrainian heritage. And my question is about the way the concept and the understanding of heritage, cultural heritage, has been changing in Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. So Blair Rubble, you spoke about Ukrainians' distinctiveness, right? But of course, this question of distinctiveness is challenging and interesting and multi-layered when we're dealing with Ukraine, right? And of course, while Russia undeniably directly attacking Ukrainian symbolic heritage, it's also attacking heritage that is shared, right? When the Literary Museum in Odessa is bombed, it is also artifacts that and monuments that are very important for Russian culture that are being attacked, right? We have Pushkin archives there. And so it's, in some ways, Russia is waging the war against culture in general, right? Culture that is Ukrainian and culture that is of Ukraine but could be shared, right? And then on the other hand, we can also say that pretty much until the start of the full-scale war, preserving Soviet, for instance, architectural heritage in Ukraine was a challenge, right? After decommunization, we saw a destruction of Soviet Ukrainian mosaics. Recently, Держпром building was bombed by the Russians, but until the full-scale aggression, it was difficult for Ukrainian art historians to recognize the value of Ukrainian Soviet heritage, right? So there are multiple layers of conflicts. So my question to you is, do you see a sort of development and redefinition, or maybe points of arguments or contention about what constitutes Ukrainian cultural heritage when we're speaking about Soviet cultural heritage in Ukraine, Russophone Russian cultural heritage of Ukraine, and how do those kind of points of contentions get negotiated and resolved? Thank you very much.
I'll kick this off. I think there is an enormous conversation that Ukraine is going to have to engage in. This isn't the moment, but I think it's already beginning. What's Ukrainian? And Ukraine has historically always been a crossroads. Its political boundaries have moved about. Is the Habsburgian architecture of Lviv Ukrainian? Is it Habsburgian? Is it European? Is it Armenian? There's a large Armenian historic presence in Lviv. And I think that following independence, there was the beginning of a conversation about what is Ukraine. Does the very long, distinguished, and powerful Jewish heritage in that region constitute Ukrainian culture? And at a certain sense, the response about the Soviet period is this, in some ways, the simplest. And even then, you mentioned Kharkiv. Kharkiv, without question, and if anybody wants to challenge this, they should take a look at the response of Kharkiv during this war, is part of Ukraine. Yet it was also the Soviet capital of Ukraine, and out of that came a heritage of some of the most important constructivist buildings ever built. Is that Ukrainian? Is that Soviet? At what point does Soviet become Ukrainian? This is a conversation that lies ahead. And I think what is important at this point is it's pretty clear there has to be a conversation about what is Ukrainian. And I don't think that that's in doubt anymore, but there are going to be very complicated pieces to that. We have Sergei Zhuk here, who wrote about the Protestant heritage of southeastern Ukraine. How does Protestantism fit into this picture, let alone Islam and various Christian, Catholic and Orthodox divisions? So this is a big question that lies ahead, and work like you're doing is going to be very important to framing that conversation.
Let's take a question in the back.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Ekaterina Klimenko. I'm also a Billington Fellow here at Canon. So thank you very much for this fantastic event, I would say. And my question is, have you been able to look at the Russia's attempts to I'm looking for a verb, not create, but maybe impose certain cultural artifacts on the occupied territory of Ukraine? Because when we're talking about this cultural colonization of Ukraine that is ongoing, it's not only about erasure of the Ukrainian heritage that is already there. It's also about imposing certain parts of Soviet, quasi-Soviet, Russian heritage. For instance, we know that there are monuments that are being built, but maybe there is more that we don't know about yet. So have you been able to look into that? So, thank you.
I would say look at that Small World Wars Journal article from January 2022, because I think in there it's documented the kind of public memorial. They're basically monuments being built in public spaces. Right? Parks, public areas, plazas, and so on. And those are categorized. A lot had to do with the 2014, and legitimating the 2014, takeover of Crimea, for example. There were monuments to Stalin, to the Russian Empire, to World War II. and the Soviet battles. So, and remember, Putin was accusing the Ukrainians of being Nazis. So, there was a panoply of those kind of constructions of identity and identity building in those occupied areas. So I would take a look at that article as a starting point.
And maybe that's a good point just to underscore for people here online audience. If people want to find your resources, what's the best? Do they Google Smithsonian, then Google the culture? Or how do they get to where?
So the best way to get to our research pages is the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative's website, and then just go to the research tab there, and they'll find all of our activities and publications.
Okay, excellent.
And building on what Richard said, I wanted to also add that one of our other research areas has been with the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab, and our colleagues there, looking at, and generously funded by State Department's Education and Cultural Affairs Division, looking at Russian malign influence using cultural heritage. And statue construction is just one part of it, and it certainly isn't limited to occupied areas. It's really showing up in a lot of spaces. And it's something that, we know cultural heritage is used politically all over the world for all sorts of reasons. But tracking this and getting really measured statistics on it has been surprising. And so you're absolutely right. It is cultural heritage, and particularly construction of sculptures or memorialization of events and gatherings. That's been something that's really been showing up quite a bit.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's get a question right there. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a fascinating panel, and thank you to the Wilson Center for doing this. I'm Allison Dundees-Renteln. I'm usually a professor of political science at the University of Southern California, but I have a fellowship from the Council on Foreign Relations to work at the World Bank on protecting cultural heritage during armed conflict in Gaza and the West Bank. And so I wanted to ask about what techniques you would recommend for protecting intangible cultural heritage, since our focus has mainly been on tangible. I have some difficulty with the terminology because a chess game, the game is tangible, the rules by which we play are intangible. So I would prefer, to use the term folklore, folk music, folk dance, folk medicine, and so on. So one question is about what have been successful techniques for recording folk tales, proverbs, some of the other aspects of Ukrainian cultural heritage. And then the second question is about how measurement, and maybe we could discuss this later if it's too much, but the metrics for measuring the value of lost cultural heritage, since there are different definitions about what is cultural heritage, not just UNESCO World Heritage Sites, but local museums and so on. And so how to handle consulting local communities about which things they want to have preserved in that process. The second one may be too much, but thank you again.
Well, it's a big question. I ran the Folklife Center at the Smithsonian for 20 years and helped with and continue to work on UNESCO treaties and other programs with regard to intangible cultural heritage. And intangible cultural heritage is much harder to deal with in a way. Building is, okay, it falls down, or you have artifacts that you're looking to protect. It's clearer about what you have to do. When you're dealing with intangible cultural heritage, you're really dealing with community life. You're dealing with cultural exemplars. You lose somebody that themselves embodies that kind of heritage, and you lose, by losing that person, you lose a library of, cultural knowledge. So it's hard. I know when we were dealing first with Haiti in that respect, because quite frankly, most, Haiti's cultural heritage was alive with its people. That's what people really did. And, you could preserve, in that sense, a community temple or something. But it was really the people who practiced at that temple. It wasn't the artifacts of the temple. So it takes a much greater effort, and a much more organized effort to do. I think Ukrainians themselves have been doing that in terms of documenting. And I think one of the stories of the, of the conflict have been people kind of practicing their music, singing their song, doing their thing in the face of bombs. Like, don't you have to get into shelter? No, I'm going to play this song. I'm going to look up to the sky, and I'm going to say my piece. So I think we've taken heart by a lot of the efforts of our Ukrainian colleagues. And Ihor Poshovalov, for example, is a folklorist. I mean, that's how he originally came to the Smithsonian. But again, mobilizing those kind of efforts, not that easy to do especially during conflict. We have done programs in the face of those disasters, even in the United States. So we got into it after Katrina in terms of working with people from New Orleans because of the great exodus, people losing that basis of their cultural heritage. Hey, you have New Orleans, jazz, the Creole culture, Cajun culture, so on, so much involved in that, and doing programs with the community to try to encourage it. In Haiti, we encouraged our programs. There were kids going to school in school buses because there were no schools. They were all bombed out, but you still had to go to school. And in school buses, there was a fellow who's the head of the art school who started encouraging children to do artwork, to paint the disaster. What art became? That art in class wasn't just some assignment, it was therapy. It was a way of kids painting what had happened to them, their families, and their relatives. And a lot of oral histories were being done and so on. So there's so many efforts in Ukraine that I don't know of, I imagine, but it's very rich. And as we saw with the various folk song groups that we brought to the mall 2 years ago, those people are singing those songs, documenting those songs, and by singing, they are exerting their identity and who they are. It's an act of assertion and resistance, in a way, to what's happening around them.
I've been writing since the war began every week about the response of the arts in Ukraine, and it's remarkable. There's a flowering of arts. But one small point, a lot of these efforts, the remarkable flowering of Ukrainian theater, a lot of the music, has been supported primarily by European funders, but the storyteller who is the memory of a community is important, but he can't tell his story if there's not support for him to tell the story. And I think an institution like the World Bank can very much invest in the infrastructure that allows the cultural vibrancy that's there to be sustained. And not just the World Bank, but I think it's important to remember we need partnerships that view these activities as important.
And remember, during any recovery, those arts, those forms of expression, whether it's music, plays, movies, book writing, theater, whatever it is so vital. When after that earthquake in Haiti, where did we get the first funding from? Where did we get funding for that? Because we had no government money. It was too quick to operate. Blair, you make a good point. Government's very slow. We actually got the money for Haiti's effort to preserve its arts and culture from the Broadway League in New York. Why did the Broadway League give money to Haiti to support its arts and culture? Well, it was Broadway. And after 9/11, they knew the value of getting lights up in Broadway. It was a way of saying, we're not dark, we're not dead. And Broadway is our intangible cultural heritage in New York. And so we're going to get the lights up on Broadway. So when Haiti happened, it was through the president's committee, Ms. Obama's committee, and it was a Broadway producer, Margot Lyon, who was the link to that. And they got us the money to start that project in Haiti because they knew getting culture up and running again, that vital, intangible culture in New York was so important in its recovery from 9/11, and the Haitian earthquake was the equivalent in Haiti of 9/11.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. Take one question there.
Thank you very much. Martha Holder from the Foundation to Preserve Ukraine's Sacred Arts. I may have misunderstood the response from Dr. Lubo, but I do think Ukrainians have a very strong identity of who they are. I don't think there's a lot of question in who they are. They would not be so resilient without having the identity of being Ukrainian. So despite the various architectural elements or the so-called tangible arts, there's a very strong Ukrainian identity that has existed for centuries. So I want to a little bit sort of have you, they went through a process of nation building. This is that Russia has not gone through. Russia's always been an empire. It never went through a nation building process. Ukraine has gone through a nation building process, and they understand themselves as Ukrainians. So
I certainly don't doubt that there's a strong Ukrainian identity. I do think moving forward, there is a discussion to be had about the histories of the people who have inhabited and still inhabit the territory of contemporary Ukraine. What does it mean to be a Crimean Tatar? How does Crimean Tatar culture interact with the nation-building process in Ukraine? And around the world, to make a general observation, nation-building sometimes leaves out critical elements of the people who are in a specific place. And I think that there is a very serious conversation, which, to be fair, began with the Ukrainian independence. I'm going to push back a little bit on this. I have been at discussions where people have talked about, this is before the war, but Ukrainians have maintained that Jewish culture and Chernovtsi is not part of Ukrainian culture. This is an issue that needs to be sorted out. There are ways in which it can happen. I think if you take a look at a series of Ukrainian history books that came out following independence, among the most controversial ones are the ones who tell the story of contemporary Ukraine with Jews and Russians and Roma in it. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a strong Ukrainian culture, but it does mean that in a 21st century full of diverse states, nation states, how does a culture accommodate diversity? And I think that discussion still will be taking place. That doesn't undermine the fact that I said it, Ukrainians have been heroic in protecting what it means to be Ukrainian. But I think there's another stage that is going to be coming.
Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Rubel. I think Ukraine is very much in the place where this discussion is already taking place. Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned Jewish museums, let me remind you that the Kennan Institute in Kiev in 2017 has held a 3-day seminar with help of our Israeli colleagues in museums discussing how to preserve Ukrainian Jewish heritage in a number of Jewish museums that already take place. Since you mentioned Crimean Tatars, let me once again remind you that right now the government of Ukraine has announced the Global Coalition of Ukrainian Studies and is pushing very hard in the United States and globally to establish not only centers of Ukrainian studies in this country, but also centers of Crimean Tatar studies, because Crimeans and Crimea are Ukraine. I think the question that has stirred so much debate right now has not been about that. The question was whether the Soviet heritage that is being destroyed now by Russian missiles is considered to be a Ukrainian heritage, why Ukrainians are claiming this as a Ukrainian heritage. I'm sorry, when Russians are sending missiles to Babet Yar, they are attacking Ukraine. And that is what we will be standing for very strongly. The discussion of what consists Ukraine, Armenians, yes, the city of Lviv is proud of its multicultural heritage, and Ukraine is proud of its multicultural heritage, and that's what we are standing for because we are a democratic state. So the crime of aggression that has been at the core of this issue has nothing to do with which heritage is being attacked, Romanian Israeli, Jewish, Crimean, Tatar. The country is attacking the state of Ukraine and its heritage as a state of Ukraine. And that's what we are fighting for now.
Katya, I absolutely agree with you, and one of the reasons why I'm raising these issues is because of Kennan Institute activities in the Ukraine 15 years ago. And these are issues that have been debated, and I think it's very exactly what you're saying. Let's take the issue of Armenian culture in Lviv. Lviv is a very good example of embracing a multicultural identity. The Armenian identity, the Polish identity, these are all conflictual, but those discussions are taking place. And they're going to have to continue because the sovereign state of Ukraine incorporates many different confessional backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, the issue, all of which will help answer the question, what does the Soviet legacy represent? Because then the Soviet legacy is part of a bigger discussion. Again, Kharkiv. Kharkiv has demonstrated over the past nearly 3 years, it is one of the most Ukrainian cities that exists. The brutality that has been inflicted on Kharkiv is unlike that of any other non-occupied territory. A big part of what Kharkiv is rests on the inheritance of those Soviet institutions. So how do you, I would imagine one of the first things that will happen is that the Prom Dome will be rebuilt. And it should be, but these are questions that are going to be out there no matter what happens. And to make a final point, the Russians have attacked it all. So the Russian position on this is also clear. None of this exists separate from Russia. So this isn't, I'm not talking about letting that point fall from the table. I'm talking about internal conversations, which you played a role in launching when you were with us. Your foundation actually has supported some of this work. Sergei Zhuk, as I mentioned, has written about the Protestant heritage of Ukraine. These are all issues that are out there that will be unresolved when the fighting stops. And because Ukraine is going to be a democracy, there'll be opportunities to work them out.
We are unfortunately at time. I want to thank our guests, Dr. Koren, Dr. Hansen, Dr. Rubel, for excellent comments, and the audience for excellent questions. I will say one thing I find heartening in a very distressing discussion is, frankly, all the people that are coming together. Like, I thought it was excellent when you said, the FBI trying to come in and actually through their technology, right, appropriate that and say, how can you document? And the example of Uber, right, people going around. So I think this is actually heartening that it's actually becoming an issue which people are collectively coming together and realizing they need to take part in right now. So I want to thank very much our guests, thank the audience, both in person, online, for excellent questions, and we look forward to seeing everyone again soon.
Thank you.